We're going to talk about some slightly different things today that relate to taking, the patterns we're seeing today and just taking them slightly back into deeper time so we can look at what we can learn from the past about how it's affecting, some of the patterns that we've been talking about over the last few days with modern lemurs. I'm the one up here talking, but this is really the result of work from many, many different people. And so first I would like to dedicate the talk to a couple of people who are on my dissertation committee many years ago now, but who formulated a lot of how, myself and I think members of this team have approached questions like this. So Elwyn Simons, who was a former director of the Duke Lemur Center several years ago, who unfortunately passed away this past year, as well as Bob Sussman, who was on the member of the board of directors and really helped formulate the way that we approach some of these questions. So I would like to dedicate this talk to these two men who I think really helped frame a lot of some interesting questions in Madagascar that relate to how we frame questions about the past relative to the present. And also acknowledge that I'm, again, the one up here talking, but this is the result of many different collaborations with Elwyn, but also Lori, who's somewhere in here somewhere, I think, yeah, wave your hand, and Brooke Crowley, who I think is also here, as well as Steve Goodman, PJ Perry, and Greg Faunal, director of the DLC Division of Fossil Primates. All right, so we do tend to divide the island into an eastern wet or humid side to the island, which incorporates the ecoregions as defined by the WWF as the lowland humid forest, and then subhumid forest, which today exists only in a couple of different regions, but in higher elevation areas. So we're talking about the Samburanu up in the northwest there, and a few isolated pockets throughout the central highlands. And then the west, which is considered the drier side of the island, which consists of the dry deciduous forest towards the north, the spiny thicket or the desert type habitat in the very south, and then kind of a mixture in between in the Midwest, which is the succulent woodland. Can I have the next slide, please? And this division between east and west is really accentuated by the fact that the central highlands of Madagascar is denuded of most of its original vegetation, although that's some controversy. And today consists of mainly grasslands of unknown origin. And so we're just going to call that center for the purposes of this talk. But those differences between east and west may just be accentuated by the fact that we have lost most of the vegetation on the center of the island. Next slide, please. And we know that this is true because we have many subfossil localities that exist across the island, with the exception of the eastern highlands and the Samburanu, where probably the humid conditions make preservations of fossils just not great for preservation of fossils. But we do have several locations in the center of the island where we get many diverse extinct animals, but also still living animals, where we can see the difference between where they existed in the past and where they exist today. So this subfossil locality component to the story is actually key in trying to understand how we understand animals are distributed across the island today. Yeah, that's great. So before I get into that, let's just talk about the bestiary, or the cast of characters, which maybe most people in the audience haven't thought too much about, but the extinct giant lemurs. So these are the animals that existed on the island until anywhere between 500 to 100 years ago, for some of the animals we're talking about, but are extinct today. And we can divide them into 5 families. The first I'll just kind of describe very briefly to you, are Megalodaphidae, which consists of 2 to 3 extinct species, and these are the group of animals that we refer to as the koala lemurs. So slow climbing, quadrumanous climbing, arboreal animals, very strictly leaf eating, and have all of the dental and postcranial adaptations to support those hypotheses. The Paleoprothethidae, or the sloth lemurs, which include 8 extinct species, and these were under branch, hanging, suspensory primates, sloth lemurs, because of those adaptations that are similar to modern day sloths. Again, very folivorous animals. And then finally, Archaeolemuridae, which are referred to in general as the monkey lemurs, which include 3 extinct species and are generally considered more or less terrestrial, although probably going up in the trees quite a bit. Various forms of diet that probably include a lot of hard object feeders and a lot of strict, very interesting coevolutionary relationships with some of the large seed-producing plants, especially down in the southwest. So very, very, very interesting group that Lori Godfrey will be happy to talk to about in more detail. And then there's two families of modern families of lemurs that also included extinct species. So there was a giant II, Domitonia robusta, which has recently gone extinct. And then Lemuridae, there were two extinct species of pachylemur, which were considered to be very similar to modern-day Varesia. And they're called the giant lemurs because they are larger than all of the living species that we know today. So this is from the Lemur Conservation book, and this is a figure you probably have all seen, but here's the modern-day largest living lemur, which is about 7.5 kilos, and then the largest extinct lemur was about 200 kilos. So the size of an orang, very, very large, and I like to put this out there because some people still think that the giant lemurs are like dinosaurs. They weren't like that big, but they were bigger than they're bigger than living lemurs, and there were some that were only slightly larger than the living injury, but did span the variation, a lot of size variation in these animals. And then with this extinct fauna, these guys, they went extinct within the last 500 years, right? That we know that we have great radiocarbon dates that that indicate to us that they overlapped with the arrival of humans for thousands of years. And we think that human arrival to the island was, somewhere between 4,300, 2,500 years ago, and that these animals existed until 500. So we have to remember that these are not some way past members of some fossil communities, that these are actually members of living primate and mammal communities. They form part of the same ecosystems, right? And so this is a picture that I took many, many years ago when I visited Appenhoel, which is a primate sanctuary out in the Netherlands, and they have free-ranging primates, including lemurs there, and they had this statue of Megalodopus, one of the sloth lemurs, this large guy here, and one of the free-ranging lemurs that just kind of perched next to it. And at the time, I wasn't studying fossil lemurs, but it's an image that I use many, many times, so I'm very grateful I took this image. But this is an image to show that Megalodopus was coexisting with Lemur cata, which is a living form. And so really the extinct forms were kind of removed from living mammal communities, and we have to think that not only that the ecosystems we see today are just remnants of things that exist in the past, but also that we do have subfossil evidence for some of the still extant lemurs and other mammals, and we can think of those as being survivors of this extinction event and compare where they exist in the past to where they exist in the present. And that's normally what I focus on in much of my research. So we do have these subfossil localities. They do exist all over the island except for the more humid parts of the island. And we do have some of these subfossil localities very rich in many of these animals across the center of the island where there is this controversy over what kind of habitats existed in the past. And based on the animals that exist at these subfossil localities, there have been a couple of different hypotheses that have arisen to account for how we get this distribution of animals that we see both today and in the past. So one hypothesis is the humid forest faunal corridor hypothesis. And this is consistent with an east-west biogeographic disjunction between living animals and the plants, and has been worked on by many different people in very different iterations. But essentially, the kinds of animals that are found in the subfossil localities on the center of the island, they seem to indicate that there's a mixture of both more humid forest-type animals together with animals that live today in more dry environments, or we can reconstruct them as existing in more dry environments. So what the humid forest faunal corridor hypothesis suggests is that in the past, that the humid forest actually continued, at least in some kind of corridor fashion, across certain parts of the Central Highlands, such that animals that are adapted towards more humid eastern forest-type conditions could use these corridors to migrate and disperse from the eastern side of the island across the west. And this is supported by some patches of humid forest that exist in this south central part of the island, and also by paleontological evidence. So what is that paleontological evidence? There's a couple of sites that we can point to for looking at evidence for this hypothesis. One that has great promise is a new fossil locality that has been worked at, I'm involved with, but is spearheaded mainly by Laurie Godfrey and Alfie Rosenberger, so Tsinam Pet Stutes, which is down in the south. So if you didn't see the video yesterday that was playing at the DLC, please see Laurie to talk about it, because it's an amazing site, underwater subfossil locality. But I'm going to talk a little about just Ankylitelo, which is the youngest known subfossil site, and also produce a wealth of small mammals that are associated with the giant lemurs that show some interesting biogeographical evidence towards this hypothesis, and which is mainly housed here at the DFP. So this is not a lemur. Okay, and there are lemurs, still extant lemurs at this locality, but I did want to show one of the more interesting animals that come out of this subfossil small mammal sample, and it demonstrates that there are significant biogeographical shifts in still extant mammals when we look at their occurrence in the subfossil record. So what we're actually looking at here are the teeth of a shrew tenrec microgale, and so 3 different kinds. So these are the occlusal surfaces. Does this have a thing? Okay, these are the occlusal surfaces of the upper dentition, the maxillary dentition. So we have microgale brevicaudata, microgale nasolui, and microgale majori. So we are looking at just the occlusal surfaces and see that there is some diversity in the types of these tiny, tiny animals. The scale is 1 millimeter that we see just in terms of the alpha taxonomy of animals that were recovered from this subfossil site. So just to get some beautiful fossils in there. But if we look at their modern geographic distribution, because these are animals that are still alive today, okay, then we see that today these animals live nowhere near the area of the cave, which is indicated by yellow, and that they indicate kind of a mixture of both that eastern and western forest fauna in this one locality, in an area where you might expect if there was this humid forest corridor existing across that part of the island. So very interesting kind of biogeographical evidence. If we were looking at another form of paleontological evidence, we do have one subfossil site that is right in the middle of this Central Highlands, which is the Christmas River locality, which has been dated to quite a bit older, 10,000 years before present, which is a site where Pat Wright initially started working, and we wrote up a few years ago. And so here's the excavation that was led by Pat Wright in 2009. So it's a different kind of fossil locality from most localities that exist in Madagascar, that you actually have some stratigraphy, and you have to do a lot of digging to uncover, to get down to the levels from which the fossils are eroding. And here are some of the fossils that have come out of that site. So again, some non-primates. So the hippo, we have a hippo that actually tends to occur more on the coast than does in the Central Highlands. And then 3 of the giant lemurs here, Megalatopus, Edward's eye, Archaelemur majori, and Pachylemur insignis. And if we look at the distribution of just those extinct primates, then you see that these primates tend to be southern limited, actually, right? When they don't have the broad distribution that we saw in that microgale and that shrew tenrec distribution. So this is giving a slightly different biogeographic signal, and indicating that some of these animals may have been southern limited, although we do have Archaelemur majori and Pachylemur insignis occurring up in the northwest, which is something that we're still trying to figure out. So a slightly different signal that they're not coming from all across the island, but just maybe limited to that southern portion. So we do have this humid forest faunal corridor hypothesis, which suggests that there is this link between the east and west, at least in the south, but there's also presence of southern limited extinct taxa at Christmas River. So there is an alternative hypothesis that has been put out a little more recently, and that is the retreat dispersion watershed hypothesis that relates to the fact that that migration across the island may have been related to areas where we have high elevation. And in particular, summits that reach above altitudes of about 6,500 feet or 2,000 meters, of which there are 3 on the island. There's one in the north up there in the north. You can see it, Serat Sadsanana, Karatra in the mid of the island, and then Dringatra down towards the south. And this is a hypothesis that's consistent with centers of endemism in modern fauna that are at low elevation. So let's explain that a little bit more. And so this is a hypothesis that suggests that the patterns of endemism we see today in both the animals and in the plants actually relate to more historical geological processes, in particular the periodic glaciations of the Quaternary period, rather than an east-west divide that has associated with whatever denuded the Central Highlands humans, or some people still argue that there is a more natural component to that. So if we look at this hypothesis, this is the closest thing I have to a cute lemur video, okay? So it's my little animation of what might have happened during the last glacial maximum, or LGM, is that during these periods of periodic glaciation, there was increased times of aridity and cool temperatures, and this was differentially affected low altitudes at the base of mountains rather than high altitudes. And this is because orographic precipitation tended to keep those higher altitudes moist. And it's also because many of these mountains have riverine systems that actually have their sources towards the top of the mountaintops, okay? So that they're already moister, but the addition of more orographic precipitation would actually increase that and maintain that mesic environment even in periods of greater aridity during the LGM. And that this would allow the lemurs that were associated with these higher altitudes a place to disperse when the lower altitudes were becoming more arid during these periods of glaciation. And only would allow them to disperse up into higher altitudes, but that if they're in particular watersheds, that they could actually, whoops, I went backwards, I think. They could actually migrate between mountaintops, right? So they could retreat upwards, and they can also disperse between these watersheds. But that this effect wouldn't be felt equally across the different watersheds, and that if you were a hypothetical lemur that was living at a lower watershed that did not have access to these more mesic riverine corridors between mountaintops, that would actually facilitate allopatric speciation in lowlands if you were isolated for long enough in these more arid conditions, such that when conditions return to non-glacier times, that enough time would have passed that allopatric speciation would have occurred. So this suggests that the patterns of endemism that you see in modern-day lemurs are more consistent with endemism at lower elevation, and that's what these color-coded areas represent, are the areas that Wilmé et al., who formalized this hypothesis in 2006, would predict that these would be the centers of endemism. And when you look at several of modern lemurs, and what you might see, and this is some work by Ann and Heckman, Ann Yoder and Heckman in 2006, that you see that you actually see some of these that correlates with some of the patterns of endemism that you pick up in some of the mouse lemurs. So the research question is, can geographic patterning in extinct lemur occurrence data actually shed light on hypotheses about past dispersal corridors? So we have the two hypotheses, and I'll just have a spoiler alert and say that at the end it's probably going to be why not both, that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive hypotheses. So here's our data. We looked at extinct lemur occurrence data across the island. So we have 17 extinct lemur species at 147 occurrences, and we came to about 26 localities after removing localities with less than 3 species. And I'm just going to present the extinct lemur data, although we're working on the still extant lemurs and other mammals as well to look at these questions. Our data was that we looked at the World Climb database and looking at information for elevation at these sites, as well as mean annual precipitation, but also paleoclimate, which is now incorporated into World Climb database. And we used the paleoclimate not just straight, but looking at the LGM precipitation anomaly, so the difference between the precipitation that has been reconstructed at the last glacial maximum and basically comparing it to modern day conditions, which allowed us to downscale that information to a scale which makes sense for Madagascar, and also relate that data to modern conditions. So the first thing we did is just look at similarity amongst the extinct lemur species, and we know that these animals are widespread across the island, but we can also see that despite the fact that many of these animals exist across the island, there is some regionalization. And if we do an UPGMA analysis based on the Jacquard Similarity Index, that we do get a regionalization between the north, northwest, and mid-central sites versus the south, southwest, and south central sites. And that within that, if we put, we try to group the high elevation sites together, that within the north, it does seem to have a higher elevation sites tend to group together, but within the south, we don't get that nice pattern, and that Christmas River, which is that south central site, it tends to group more with the southern localities, whereas the Empuza and Nkomaka tend to group with the more south central localities on the central highlands. So not as neat there. But what we wanted to see is, since there seems to be this geographic component to the way that they're grouping, is lemur distribution actually related to distance between sites, which you expect, yes, right? So what we're looking at here is a measure of faunal similarity distance versus geographic distance for pairwise comparisons of these extinct lemur localities. And so each circle, actually, you can think about this graph as being in contrast space. So the circle represents a pairwise comparison between sites. And so that's how we get 325 pairwise comparisons. So you can see that there is a significant positive correlation between faunal similarity and geographic distance, right? Which is what you would expect. And what we're really interested in is holding geographic distance. Do you still get a similarity, a relationship between faunal similarity and elevation or precipitation? So we took the residuals from this graph and we looked at that relationship. So this is residual faunal distance versus differences in elevation, and you can see that we still get a positive relationship. So that faunal similarity seems to be correlated with elevation. And elevation can be a shorthand measure for many different ecological categories, such as precipitation, which is what we were mainly interested in. So we looked at that more specifically and looked at faunal similarity, the residuals from that analysis, holding elevation constant with the LGM precipitation anomaly that we calculated. And again, you can see that there is a very significant relationship between giant lemur occurrence data and this paleo data. So, which maybe is not that surprising, but it's the first time to our knowledge that we're actually looking at that correlation between paleo climate and patterns of occurrence in the extinct lemurs. So our results demonstrate a strong distinction between northern and southern extinct communities. Elevation and paleo precipitation are major determinants of extinct lemur distribution patterns across Madagascar, and that's controlling for geographic distance between localities. And these results suggest that extinct lemur distribution patterns are correlated with high elevation areas where rainforest was most likely to persist throughout the glacial periods. So in conclusion, can geographic patterning and extinct lemur occurrence data shed light on hypotheses about past dispersal corridors? We think so. And it can come in many forms. The extinct lemur data seems to indicate kind of a northwest divide, but some of the stuff we're getting that I didn't talk about today also indicates it might be a little more complex. And so, we'd like to say, why not both? Why can't it be a situation where the eastern rainforest communities maybe were substantially different than those that occur on the western, on the escarpment, and then towards the west, so that you have the encircled area here, which would be an endemic, an area of endemism amongst the lemur fauna, and that maybe there was a corridor that existed that extended across the west and from which animals dispersed into the north and to the west from that area, and then south of one of the major river systems, so there would be another corridor that would allow animals to exist, to spread towards the west and in the south. So our general conclusion is why not both, that they're not mutually exclusive, and that we are seeing patterns, I think, that would support both of these hypotheses. All right, so again, I'd just like to acknowledge everybody that's contributed to this project, but also the Duke Lemur Center for having me here to talk, and I'm happy to take any questions.